Hey everyone, Reaper here again with another video. This time I want to talk a little bit about Sony Playstation collecting and my memories with the system. I think personally the Sony Playstation was one of the best, if not the best, video game systems ever released. And I'm talking about Sony Playstation 1. I mean, of course, we play Sony PlayStation 4. It has better graphics and all that other stuff. That no doubt, no doubt. But I think that the Sony PlayStation 1, or PS1 as I will call it throughout the video, definitely changed the face of video game console playing when it first launched in September of 1995. Definitely a system that I have so many great memories with, and it has such a wonderful library of, a large library too, of wonderful games to match it. So let's talk a little bit about what it looks like and a bunch of other things about it. So let me just reach over here and get it. This is my original Sony PlayStation that I got for Christmas 1996, almost a year and a half, year and 4 months after it released here in the United States. So there's nothing really that spectacular about it. Now, one of the first year that the PlayStation was out, some of those early models, it's very important whenever you're mentioning the Sony PlayStation, it's important to mention that the early models of the PlayStation did experience, a large amount did experience overheating. And that was largely because of the placement of the air vents. You'd be playing the game, and when I say overheating, it didn't mean like smoke was coming out of it. It meant it would just freeze because the vents weren't placed where the fan was or something like that, and it would cause the game to stop playing. Later models, this one, the one that I have, later corrected it, or it wasn't so bad. But one of the things that people did back then, remember we talked about those old Nintendo games or Genesis games, very rarely Genesis, but those old Nintendo games. Whenever the game wouldn't go on or it would stop, you take the cartridge out, right? And you do what? Old Nintendo cartridge, Mega Man. You go thinking that it had dust. Well, it didn't have dust. It was just that the pins inside the Nintendo system were not good, and they weren't making contact with the cartridge inside. But we thought that we were actually helping make the game work. But with the Sony PlayStation, one of those earlier models, some of those troubleshooting, if you will, what you did was you turned it upside down. You turned it upside down and it worked. It didn't overheat. I guess because the vents were exposed to air. You would never play the Sony PlayStation on the rug or anything like that, as you would with maybe the Super Nintendo or the Genesis. You would never put the PlayStation on the rug because the heat from the rug and the vents would cause it to overheat fairly quickly. So that was one of the early struggles of the Sony PlayStation. What they had at the time, for those that had that problem, that did not want to turn their system upside down, was something called Game Ice. It was this contraption that you would put the Sony PlayStation on top of, sort of like the old Model 1 Sega CD that I showed, where the Genesis sat on top of the Sega CD, and you would put the power on and it would generate air underneath the PlayStation so it wouldn't overheat, and they called it Game Ice. My friend had it, and he never had a problem. Never had a problem afterwards. I didn't have it. What I did was, and I'll show this in a future video, I mounted the PlayStation on this old piece of furniture that I had, and I had these like little wooden pedestals that I would rest the PlayStation on top of. So there was a considerable amount of distance between the bottom of the PlayStation and the piece of furniture, so there would be air in there, between there, and never had a problem with overheating. So that was one of the little things about the PlayStation. Hey, first models, first releases, they all have their bugs, right? And you learn and you fix them. So the Sony PlayStation, let's talk a little bit more. We're going to get into some more things about it. This is what the controller looked like. This was the original controller before they went to the analog controller. Now mine is, I haven't used this since I think 2000. It's dusty, it's old, but it still works, I think. Well, at least I hope it does. I haven't used it since 2000. I don't see why it wouldn't. But eventually they went to the analog. Because, this was the era of 3D games, and Sony PlayStation was built to handle 3D games. So how do you play 3D games? It's better to use an analog stick than a directional pad. You still use your directional pad for certain things. Every controller has a directional pad, but now every controller has an analog stick too. I believe that Nintendo 64 was the first controller to have an analog. Sony later released theirs, and I think they did it better. And it also had a rumble feature in it, which I think Nintendo was the first to have a rumble. The N64 had a pack you would stick in the back of the controller called the rumble pack. And for certain things in the game, like action sequences, the controller would shake, to add to the experience. Well, Sony later added that to what they call the DualShock controller. So, and I think they did it better than Nintendo. But that was what the controller did. But the thing is, though, we talk about, I've been bringing up Nintendo. Well, where do you think Sony got the idea for their controller? The layout of it. Let's get the original one back up. The directional pad. Well, the directional pad's been pretty standard, but the layout, the 4 buttons in a cross manner, shoulder buttons. They got that idea from the Super Nintendo controller. Cross pattern buttons, shoulder buttons. The PlayStation had more shoulder buttons. They got it from this. Now, why do you think? You see, I thought that was a better model than the old Genesis. They had the directional pad, which wasn't that great. And it was a cool looking controller, black, sleek, pretty futuristic looking at the time when it came out in '89. But it had 3 buttons across, which just didn't work as well as the cross pattern 4 button controller that the Super Nintendo brought and later the Sony PlayStation made standard. Because you think about it today, most controllers, like for the Xbox, the PlayStation 4, the Switch, they all, and even generations before that with Xbox 360, Xbox, PlayStation 3 too, they all use cross-pattern button configurations. So they really, once again, going back to what I said earlier, they really set the standard for so many years, up until this day. How we play games and how we experience games and all that stuff. But let's get to Nintendo. We can't mention Sony PlayStation without mentioning the Nintendo. At the time the Sony PlayStation came out, Nintendo's big rival was Sega. They had those commercials where Sega was making fun of Nintendo, blah, blah, blah. They had the console war, and I'll make a video on that in a little bit. But I think Nintendo feared the Sony PlayStation. Well, why did they fear Sony PlayStation? Was it because it's a new competitor? Well, yeah, because Nintendo had their hand in the creation of the Sony PlayStation. Anybody that knows the history of the Sony PlayStation or Sony's relationship with Nintendo knows that every Super Nintendo has a Sony music chip in it, which is why the Super Nintendo had better sound than the Sega Genesis. But Sony had this working relationship with Nintendo that dated back to the late 80s. When the Sega CD came out or was going to come out, there was talk that, hey, Sony and Nintendo, they'll come out with their own CD system and release it in the market to be competitive, to be innovative. But Nintendo backed out of it, and this is one of the biggest blunders to ever be recorded in video game history. When Nintendo backed out of their deal with Sony, because that led to the creation of the Sony PlayStation. Originally, the Sony PlayStation was going to be called the Nintendo PlayStation. And Nintendo, I believe, even owns the rights to the name PlayStation, except they own the rights to the 2-word formation of PlayStation, PlayStation. Well, in order to get past that legally, Sony made PlayStation 1 word. And that's why they're able to use the word PlayStation. But yeah, the Sony and Nintendo became bitter rivals. And when Sony came out in the market and became a competitor, they took a lot of their third-party publishers. You see, back in the day, I know I'm giving you a lot of history and all that stuff, so please bear with me. Back in the day, a lot of third-party publishers. Now, a third-party publisher would be a publisher like Capcom, Konami, publishers that were responsible for games like Mega Man, Castlevania, and so forth. A lot of third-party publishers stood solely with Nintendo. And when the Genesis came out, a lot of them still stood with Nintendo only. It wouldn't be until maybe a couple years later these publishers would make games for the Genesis, or certain games that came out for the Super Nintendo for Genesis. So Nintendo really had a stranglehold on the industry, despite the fact that Genesis was this big console. When Sony came out and they were offering, see, when the successor to the Super Nintendo was the N64, cartridge based. But when Sony came out with disc-based gaming format, such as Mortal Kombat Trilogy, my first Sony Playstation game, and the reason why I bought a Sony Playstation, publishers wanted to make for CD. You get better. You could put full motion videos in it. They still thought that was the wave of the future. Better quality and sound, fit more memory on a disc, and they were cheaper to make. So that the allure of going to Sony was too much to resist, and to publish some of these games for cartridge on the N64 would have been too expensive, and they would not have been able to make the gaming experience for the gamers that they would have liked. So that's why publishers that strictly made games for Nintendo at that time, like Square, defected to Sony, and that really hurt Nintendo. Square made games like Final Fantasy, and Final Fantasy, you talk about some of the greatest Final Fantasy games or some of the greatest RPGs, you would find them on the Super Nintendo. Games like Final Fantasy II, which is Final Fantasy IV in Japan, Final Fantasy III, which is Final Fantasy VI in Japan. I'm not going to talk about the numbering system. Japan got more Final Fantasy games than the United States, so that's why the numbering system's messed up. It wasn't until Final Fantasy VII, which I'll show in a bit, where the numbering system in both Japan and United States became the same. But other games for Super Nintendo that Square made, like The Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger, which is sometimes regarded as one of the greatest RPGs of all time. When Square left and went to Sony and started publishing RPG after RPG, classic after classic, Nintendo really didn't stand a chance, and they were really floundering, and eventually Sega folded. But that's just a small sample of the power of this PlayStation. And like I showed you, my very first game was Mortal Kombat Trilogy. I thought this was a much better version than what Nintendo offered at the time. Big surprise, right? You can't mention the Sony PlayStation without playing Crash Bandicoot. There were 3 standard Crash Bandicoot games. This was their answer to a 2D Mario type game. Awesome. This was the second 3D fighter I ever played. The first 3D fighter I ever played was Virtua Fighter on the Saturn. And I thought that was a really interesting game. Like, wow, in 3D you're playing a fighting game, right? Well, when I played this, Tekken 2, this game just blew away Virtua Fighter, in my opinion. It was just the characters, one of the problems with Virtua Fighter was the characters moved so slowly. And, it was like, let's get on with it. I felt in Tekken 2, the characters moved fast, the action was great, the response to the inputs you would put in the button were right on target. It was a phenomenal gaming experience, and a very cool series. Now, this game is going to have its own series, but I can't talk about my love and joy for the Sony PlayStation without mentioning this game. Resident Evil. You may have heard of it, you may have seen some of the movies, whatever. There's no denying. Capcom put this out, the same people that put out the Street Fighter games and Mega Man and so many classic games. I had, at that time, I remember playing this for the first time. Like I said, I'll make a video specifically for the Resident Evil series where I go into detail. Up until that time, when this game was played, I watched it played at my friend Chris's house. His cousin brought it over. I have never experienced, up until that time, had never experienced a gaming experience like Resident Evil. It was just phenomenal. It had some of those bad FMVs and horrible voice acting, but that added charm to the game. It did not take away from the game's creepiness. It did not take away from the game's playability, entertainment, joy. You got the total package with Resident Evil, and it was truly phenomenal. Truly phenomenal. There were survival games. It's a survival horror game, and I'll talk more about that when I do the Resident Evil video game video. There were survival horror games, I believe, out before Resident Evil. I think Alone in the Dark was one of them. And of course, back in 1989, the game that is almost a spiritual successor, Resident Evil rather. Resident Evil was a spiritual successor too, also made by Capcom, was a game called Sweet Home, which originally was released for the Nintendo in Japan, which is called Famicom. Basically a survival horror RPG-ish type game. More on that later, but I can't tell you how much like the memories of playing this game or seeing it played for the first time are so vivid in my mind after 21 years. I think I first played this in 1997, 21 years ago. It's just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. I remember I mentioned Final Fantasy and Square. Final Fantasy VII. At the time when Final Fantasy VII came out, RPGs, yeah, they had their fans, but it was a real niche sort of community. It wasn't as popular as the fighting games like Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, and the 2D games like Mega Man and Castlevania, or the platformer games like Mario and so forth. Not many people played Final Fantasy, or RPGs rather. When Final Fantasy VII came out, it was mainstream. Although some may argue Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy III in North America was the best Final Fantasy, there's an argument to be made about that. But if that was the best one, this is the one that made it mainstream. It's sort of like the Elder Scrolls argument. Morrowind, some people say, was the best Elder Scrolls game, but it was Oblivion that put it on the map. Of course, one of my favorite games of all time. Truly one of the last great 2D Castlevania games to come out on home console. I mean, there were a ton of them released on handhelds, which were great games, which followed this formula, the Metroidvania formula. Fantastic game. Another RPG series that I loved tremendously, my favorite, Suikoden 2, just phenomenal. Also by Konami. I was never a fan of this video game series. I mean, there were only 2 games released in the United States at the time, but it wasn't until this game where I became a big fan of this series. Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear came out in Nintendo back in the late 80s. I was never a fan of it. I tried to play it recently, and I don't dislike it because of the graphics or anything like that. That's not one of the problems with it. I find that it's just not playable. It's just not playable. People talk about how great Metal Gear was for Nintendo. I'm sorry. Maybe the concepts of that were introduced in Metal Gear were good. The idea of sneaking around and not necessarily going balls to the wall right towards your enemy. That's a good concept, stealth. But I just think it wasn't executed too well. Well, when this bad boy came out, it was executed well, and it just created an entire series of terrific games, sometimes with convoluted storytelling, but awesome characters and a good gameplay experience. How many discs was this? 2? Wow. Fantastic. And one of there are plenty of other great games that I played that I have tremendous memories of, but I'm going to go to this one right here, Alondra. You see the foil cover? What does that mean? Have you been watching my videos? When you have a video game that has a nice foil cover and good packaging, what company put it out? Working Designs, of course. And of course they give you this dicked up looking construction manual. They give you the map and all this stuff. They give you everything, which is why I think they went out of business. Terrific game. Terrific game. And, the best thing about, some of these games can be pricey, as with any old systems, but one of the cool things about the PlayStation is you can get a majority, if not all of these games on the PlayStation Network, the PlayStation Store. If you have a PlayStation 3, or if you have a PlayStation 4, you don't have to spend $60 on Alondra. You could just download it for $4.99 and play it. I mean, if you're a collector, then that's another story. But you can play Metal Gear. You can play Suikoden, which is a $150 game. You can play Castlevania Symphony Night, which is like a $50 or $60 game. You can play Final Fantasy VII. You can play all these great games that I mentioned. That's one of the joys of Sony. Now, Nintendo does that too with their shop, you know, with the I think they're going to do something like that with the Switch, but you could do that with the Wii U. They had the Virtual Console where you could play Genesis games, TurboGrafx 16 games. That's awesome. That's awesome. But Sony, to me, for the reasons that I mentioned, some of the games I mentioned, like there's a ton of other games. I have like over 170 PlayStation games, and I'm still collecting. It's a relatively cool system to collect for. But that's one of the reasons why this system is very special to my heart. And this is the part of the video where I like to talk about, you know, with the Sega, I talked about why it failed. Well, Sony didn't fail. It put, not necessarily the Sony PlayStation 1 or PS1, but eventually the PS2. They put Sega out of the console business. They kicked Nintendo right in the balls, where they never were able to become #1 again, although the Switch is doing very well, and I'm glad for them. But for, like, almost 20 years, Nintendo became like this other video game system, like alternative video game system. Not even alternative in the sense of like, well, do you have a PlayStation or an Xbox? Not like that. It's sort of like not even competing with those two, because it's just off in this other realm of video game systems. But I think they're trying to get back into it where they're a competitor with Xbox and Sony. But it was really the PlayStation that knocked them right out of the lead, right out of the ballpark. Nintendo survived because of that Game Boy and their Game Boy systems and their DS systems. If not for those systems, Nintendo would not be around today. And they survived because of Pokemon. Yeah, Pokemon, the cards, and the games that really helped keep Nintendo afloat, where they could put video game systems out that failed and still be able to be in the business of making consoles. But if not for those things, it would have been the PS1 that would have ended Nintendo just the way they ended Sega in the console market. What followed the Sony PlayStation was the PS2, then the PS3, and now we have the PS4. All successful. PS3, I think, was the least successful of the four systems. Sony got a little arrogant with PS3, the way Nintendo was a little arrogant when it came to their dealings with the Sony before the PS1 came out. They were a little arrogant, but they recaptured what was so great about Sony, and it remains the first one, as with Sony in particular. You know, I was a Nintendo fan growing up, and I found nothing more annoying than listening to some Genesis fan talking about how great their system was. So I was really like in Nintendo's camp, but when the Sony came out, I was like, it's time for me to change. And I personally think, as I end this video, I know I went 23 minutes, blah 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 blah, yeah, I know, but I think a lot of disgruntled Nintendo fans, or Nintendo fans in general, went over to the Sony camp when Nintendo really didn't deliver on the goods, or at least delivered to what they really wanted as much. When it comes to Sony and Xbox, I think a lot of the Sega fans went over to Xbox when Sega got out of the console market, whereas the Nintendo fans that felt that Nintendo really sort of wasn't doing their job as well as they should have, I think they went over to Sony. And that's what I think. I think Sony's done a real good job with releasing some games, and they released a ton of classic games that are still legitimate today. Some are dated. You know, some of those early 3D games are not so good. That's why I've been a big fan of 2D games, because they seem to stand the test of time, the 2D games, the beautiful cartoonish looking games, whereas the 3D games of the early 3D era, not so good. But this concludes my video on my love of Sony PlayStation, my memories and Sony PlayStation collecting. Like I said, I'll maybe do a collecting video on Sony, what games to buy if you want to get into collecting for Sony, or if you want to buy some cheap games, or what expensive games you might want to add to your collection if you want to be a collector. and so forth. But thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. More video game videos to come. Take care.